Imagine walking through a glittering palace in the 1770s, golden mirrors, velvet curtains, nobles laughing over wine. But just beyond one wall, you hear muffled cries, the sound of a child's scream, drowned by aristocrats placing bets on how long the suffering will last. This isn't rumor. This was the secret pastime of Europe's most powerful elite, and the hidden truth that helped ignite revolution. Section 1. The Gilded Silence. The chandeliers of Chateau de Belcourt dripped with light like frozen rivers of fire. Mirrors taller than men reflected silk gowns and powdered wigs, multiplying the brilliance until the entire gallery shimmered with impossible luxury. Foreign dignitaries walked slack-jawed through the corridors, whispering about the unrivaled splendor of the French court. Here, they believed, was the pinnacle of civilization, order, beauty, refinement. But the truth crouched in the shadows. Behind one embroidered wall hanging, so heavy it took 2 men to lift during seasonal cleaning, a muffled sob broke through. It was not the voice of a courtier or servant, but that of a child, no older than 13. The sound rose and cracked, only to be drowned by a burst of laughter from the salon. Inside, noblemen drank crimson wine while duchesses fanned themselves with ivory, their painted smiles betraying no hint of what their ears ignored. Countess Helene de Marignac leaned across her card table, eyes glittering with cruel amusement. "How long do you wager before the boy faints?" she asked. 10 minutes, replied Lord D'Anter, without hesitation. "He looks sturdy enough to endure. I've lost too much betting against stamina." Another round of laughter. Coins clinked across the polished wood as wagers piled high. This was not whispered rumor, nor isolated vice. It was, for many of France's elite, an evening pastime. What the common people imagined as innocent soirees of music and games often concealed an uglier stage, a hidden theater of suffering, shielded by guilt and etiquette. To the peasants tilling frozen fields, starving while tides crushed them deeper into mud, the court's sins were vague tales. They knew of feasts, of diamonds, of extravagant wigs. But few could imagine the networks of cruelty that pulsed behind velvet drapes. Networks so systematic that when the revolution came, even hardened men of the guillotine shuddered at the records uncovered. Among the architects of this descent stood Armand Jean de Villiers, Duke of Montrevel. Nephew to a once famous cardinal, he had inherited both fortune and cunning. By the mid-1700s, Montrevel was whispered about in salons from Paris to Vienna as the philosopher of appetite. He carried himself with elegance, spoke with wit, and wrote letters laced with the rhetoric of Enlightenment thought. To many, he was the very model of refined nobility. Yet behind his charm lay a hunger so corrosive it devoured all restraints. Every evening, his servants presented him with a ledger he called Le Choix, a selection of human lives catalogued by age, features, and supposed virtues. He read it as one might read a wine list. With a flick of the quill, he chose his entertainment. With a smile, he justified it as exploration of human nature. And Montrevel was not alone. In Paris, the Duke of Evre maintained a townhouse where children were trained, as though they were acrobats or musicians, though the performances demanded of them were neither art nor sport. Madame de Vaurienne, mistress to a king, employed agents across provinces, seizing the desperate under guise of offering work. All contributed to what became a culture, one in which cruelty was not only tolerated but praised as sophistication. The facade of civilization gleamed brighter than ever. And yet, beneath the chandeliers, the first cracks of decay had already begun to spread. Section 2. The Society of Enlightened Curiosities. The year was 1749 when whispers first spread through the salons of Paris about a clandestine gathering calling itself La Société de Curiosités Éclairées, the Society of Enlightened Curiosities. Its founding members numbered 12 dukes, marquises, bishops, and 2 wealthy merchants whose fortunes bought them a place among the nobles' depraved games. Outwardly, the society presented itself as a philosophical circle, devoted to discussing Voltaire, Rousseau, and Locke. The facade was flawless. Invitations were written in elegant hand, sealed with wax, and carried discreetly by trusted messengers. Meetings were held in a mansion on the Rue des Équerres, its facade no different from any other hotel particulier in Paris. A passerby might hear music drifting from its windows, or the clinking of glasses, never suspecting the horrors cultivated inside. The mansion's upper floors hosted salons where poetry was read aloud and guests debated reason versus faith. But the basements, 3 levels deep, were another world entirely. There, stone chambers echoed with sounds that no philosophy could excuse. At the Society's first grand assembly, Duke Armand Jean de Montrevel himself gave a speech to inaugurate their purpose. His words, recorded by a secretary later executed in the Revolution, dripped with the elegance of Enlightenment thought twisted into grotesque justification. "Gentlemen, we are not monsters. We are explorers. What the Church calls sin, we call curiosity. What the masses call cruelty, we name philosophy. To wield power without testing its boundaries is to remain ignorant of its nature. And we, by virtue of birth, refinement, and intellect, are the chosen custodians of such experiments." Applause followed. Glasses of wine were raised. Behind them, children, brought in through the procurement bureau, operated by Madame de Vaurienne, waited in silence, trained to bow when summoned, trained not to cry too loudly lest they spoil the evening's mood. Lord Henri de Cressac, a lean man with sharp eyes and a perpetual sneer, leaned toward Montrevel and asked, "Tell me, my friend, what separates us from brutes if we indulge so freely?" Montrevel smiled. "Intention, Henri. The peasant who strikes his child in anger is base. But we, when we direct suffering, we do so with purpose. We observe. We record. We learn. That is civilization." This perverse logic spread like perfume through the society. Each chamber in the mansion was designed not merely for indulgence but for experimentation. There were journals bound in calfskin where nobles wrote of the effects of hunger, isolation, or terror on young minds. Some described it clinically, as though drafting medical reports. Others wrote with feverish detail, their words betraying not curiosity but appetite. One book, later seized by revolutionaries, contained a dialogue between Montrevel and the Bishop of Mirefleur. The bishop, robed in purple, argued that inflicting controlled suffering was a form of spiritual education. "Pain," he wrote, "is the only honest catechism. A child who suffers knows more of God than a priest who preaches." The society grew wealthy through secrecy. Nobles who wished to participate paid enormous sums, which funded the mansion, the agents who procured victims, and the bribery of officials. Even corrupt Paris police hesitated to interfere, for the influence of its members stretched to the king's own council. By 1760, La Société de Curiosities Éclairées had established branches in Lyon, Bordeaux, and even Brussels. Each followed the same pattern: salons of philosophy upstairs, hidden chambers below. The Society's documents used the language of scholarship, referring to victims as subjects, atrocities as demonstrations, and torture as lessons. The masquerade was perfect. To the outside world, Montrevel and his peers were patrons of the Enlightenment, hosting salons that advance reason and debate. But beneath, they had institutionalized depravity with bureaucratic precision. And yet, even within this society, there lurked ambitions darker still, visions of living art that would turn cruelty itself into performance. Section 3. The Theater of Flesh. By 1762, the Society of Enlightened Curiosities had grown bold. Their gatherings were no longer content with journals, private chambers, or whispered debates. They sought spectacle. They sought to make cruelty not just philosophy, but art. It was Duke Montrevel who first proposed the idea at a midnight meeting in the Rue des Équerres mansion. Standing before the gilded fireplace, his powdered wig glowing in the candlelight, he declared, "Gentlemen, knowledge is sterile unless clothed in beauty. We must create a theater where philosophy and sensation intertwine. Let us not simply record suffering, let us stage it." The room erupted with approval. Even those who hesitated at the thought of greater risks found themselves intoxicated by Montrevel's vision. And so, the Society prepared its first spectacle vivant, a living theater unlike any Paris had seen. Weeks of preparation followed. Children and young men, procured from provinces under promises of apprenticeship or service, were housed in the mansion's underground dormitories. They were fed, groomed, painted, and costumed. Some were starved deliberately, others fattened, depending on the roles assigned. A painter was hired to design the tableau, sketching figures positioned to resemble mythological scenes. The chosen theme, the fall of Icarus. On the evening of the performance, nobles gathered in the grand salon, sipping champagne as harpsichord music filled the air. They were dressed in masks of gold and velvet, as though anonymity excused participation. At the strike of 11, servants drew back embroidered curtains to reveal a stage erected at the far end of the chamber. Gasps of delight followed. Before them stood a grotesque tableau, a boy no older than 12, painted with wings of white feathers, bound to a frame that held him suspended mid-air. Around him, other youths, dressed as gods of Olympus, posed with artificial serenity while terror flickered in their eyes. The performance unfolded with chilling elegance. At Montrevel's signal, the sun was lowered, a glowing orb of candles above the boy's head. Heat rose. Wax dripped. The feathers began to blacken. The nobles applauded softly as the child squirmed, the ropes cutting into his arms. "Observe," murmured Bishop Mirefleur, jotting notes in a small leather book. "The tension between aspiration and fall. A metaphor for man's arrogance before nature." When the boy cried out, whether from pain or fear, none could say. The duchesses in attendance giggled behind their fans. Countess Helene de Marignac whispered, "Marvelous, is it not? A Greek myth reborn in flesh." The spectacle ended with the child collapsing, unconscious, into the arms of masked attendants. He was carried away behind the curtains, never to be seen again. The audience erupted in applause, as though they had witnessed a triumph of theater rather than an act of human degradation. From that night forward, the society committed itself to such productions. They called it art philosophique, philosophical art, and justified it with the language of aesthetics. Each event grew more elaborate, more dangerous, more cruel. Soon, themes were drawn from Scripture. One tableau reimagined the crucifixion with children dressed as cherubs circling the cross. Another recreated scenes from Dante's Inferno, with nobles wandering through chambers where souls writhed in contrived torment. Pain became performance. Death became spectacle. Foreign nobles traveled to Paris for the privilege of attending. Russian counts, English lords, Italian dukes, all flocked to see the new art whispered about in European courts. They returned home with tales of brilliance, never daring to speak of the suffering behind the curtain. And yet, within the salons of Bellecour in Paris, these spectacles became the height of aristocratic fashion. To be invited was a mark of prestige. To participate, an indulgence of refinement. The line between philosophy, theater, and cruelty had dissolved entirely. What remained was a culture where elegance masked horror, and laughter drowned out screams. But the greater danger lay not in the spectacles themselves, but in the appetite they created, for soon, no performance would be shocking enough to satisfy the court. Section 4. Expansion of the network. The Society of Enlightened Curiosities had begun as whispers and candlelit salons, but by the late 1760s it had metastasized into something far larger. What had once been a gathering of a dozen nobles in Paris had grown into a sprawling web stretching across the kingdom, as organized as any guild or ministry. It began with Montrevel's correspondence. He was not content with isolated performances, he sought permanence. In a letter to Lord de Cressac he wrote, "A theatre cannot thrive upon chance alone. The actor must rehearse, the audience must be certain of quality. So too must we ensure our spectacles are fed by an unbroken supply. Let us think not as aristocrats but as stewards of a science." This science took root in facilities scattered across France. In Bordeaux, a crumbling chateau overlooking the Garonne was purchased under the guise of a wine estate. Locals whispered that the place was cursed, for carriages arrived by night and children vanished by morning. Inside, the vaulted cellars became dormitories where victims were prepared. Their training was harsh and deliberate. Some were taught to stand still for hours, others to sing on command, others to smile, while tears ran silently down their cheeks. In Lyon, an abandoned textile warehouse was retrofitted into a chambered labyrinth. Wooden looms were replaced by iron frames, fabrics by painted backdrops. Here, rehearsals took place. Nobles visiting to watch their subjects endure trials disguised as performances. Those who failed to endure were discarded. Every facility kept ledgers. Pages catalogued each victim's age, build, temperament, and uses. Margins bore chilling annotations: durable, pliable, resistant. Montrevel himself demanded monthly reports. These were delivered bound in red leather, like account books from a merchant house. The agents who procured victims became a new class of predator. Disguised as recruiters for domestic service, they scoured villages and parishes. They promised parents that their sons and daughters would serve in noble households, sending home wages and letters. Many families, desperate to escape starvation, consented. Those children were loaded into wagons bound not for kitchens or stables but for the society's hidden estates. The agents grew bold. In Paris, one was overheard bragging, "The streets themselves are my market. Every orphan, every stray, it is all coin to me." Foreign alliances followed. A Polish prince visited Bordeaux, leaving with 3 performers for his own estate. An English earl wrote Montrevel that England must not fall behind in the pursuit of enlightened curiosity, enclosing gold and Madeira wine as payment. What began as sin had become industry. But with industry came risk. The more children vanished, the more rumors spread. Parish priests lamented from pulpits, "Where are our little ones gone? What hands dare spirit them into darkness?" Mothers clutched rosaries, whispering prayers for absent sons. In some villages, when recruiters returned, peasants pelted them with stones and chased them into the fields. And yet, gold and influence shielded the society. Local officials were bribed, inquiries were silenced. Montrevel, when confronted by whispers, scoffed. "Peasants will always invent tales," he told his circle. "They envy what they cannot have. The cries of the rabble are no more threat than the buzzing of flies." But beneath the gilded confidence, a storm was brewing, one that no ledger could contain. Section 5, Royal Approval. The summer of 1771 marked the Society's most dangerous victory. It was during a private visit to Chateau Belcourt that King Alaric XV himself became ensnared in Montrevel's theatre. The performance had been orchestrated by Madame de Vaurienne, ever the ambitious mistress. She wished to secure her influence at court, and what better way than by offering the king something no rival could? She transformed Bellecourt's underground galleries into an underworld straight from mythology. Stone walls were painted with scenes of flame and shadow, torches lit the halls, and mournful music echoed from hidden musicians. The theme was Orpheus descending into Hades. Nobles in masks guided the king through corridors where souls, children painted in pale ash, dressed in tattered robes, reached out with trembling hands. At the final chamber, Orpheus himself, a youth bound with chains of gold, sang a haunting aria before collapsing. The king clapped in delight. "Magnificent! Philosophy given form!" he cried. He turned to Montrevel. "You are not merely noblemen, you are artists of the soul." That night, over glasses of Burgundy, the king whispered to Madame de Vaurienne that he wanted more. "Let us make this art eternal," he said. Within months, a new bureau appeared at court, l'Office pour l'investigation philosophique, the Office for Philosophical Inquiry. Its stated mission was to advance understanding of human nature. In reality, it became the Society's official arm, complete with clerks, scribes, and couriers. The office coordinated transports, ensuring victims were moved between estates with efficiency. It collected reports, compiling them into volumes bound for the king's private library. It handled finances, distributing funds disguised as research grants. Even the army was occasionally used, under orders to escort specimens safely to their destinations. For Montrevel, it was triumph. "We are no longer shadows," he told his allies. "We are the torchbearers of philosophy, blessed by the crown." But royal approval also drew the society further into the light. Their performances grew grander, their cruelty harder to conceal. And the very machinery that made them efficient would one day provide the evidence for their destruction. Section 6. The Festivals of Living Art. By the mid-1770s, spectacles had evolved into full festivals, week-long gatherings where cruelty was staged as culture. Montrevel's Laurier estate became the jewel of these events. Its gardens were reshaped into elaborate sets. Lanterns hung from every tree, fountains dyed crimson, hedges carved into grotesque forms. Hundreds of nobles arrived in carriages, greeted by servants dressed as mythic creatures. One infamous festival became known as the Garden of Babel. A wooden tower was erected at the estate's center, 50 feet tall. Children dressed as laborers climbed the structure, hauling bricks and ropes while nobles below toasted with champagne. At intervals, nobles ordered the supports loosened. Parts of the tower collapsed, sending performers tumbling. Applause erupted. Bishop Mirefleur, ever the philosopher, declared, "Behold man's pride, toppled by his own ambition." Another tableau was staged at the Marquise de Chalon's estate, titled The Passion of Saint Lucien. Children clad in white were tied to posts in a circle. Artificial flames were lit at their feet while nobles recited scripture in mocking tones. A duchess fanned herself and whispered, "Such piety, reborn through irony!" Foreign nobles traveled across Europe to attend. Russian counts, Spanish grandees, Italian dukes, they came bearing gifts, jewels, rare wines, even exotic animals, eager to witness the notorious French art. They returned home whispering carefully, for to speak plainly would invite scandal. The festivals became status symbols. To attend was proof of sophistication. To be absent was to risk ridicule as provincial. Even nobles repulsed in private forced themselves to smile, terrified of exclusion. Yet beneath the laughter, murmurs of unease grew louder. Some nobles whispered that the spectacles had gone too far. Others admitted in private letters that they dreamed of the screams long after leaving. But the tide of appetite could not be turned. Each festival demanded greater excess. Each season, the bar of cruelty rose higher. And all the while, peasants starved at the gates, watching wagons of food, wine, and silks roll into estates where their children had vanished. Section 7. Cracks in the facade. By 1778, the great edifice of cruelty that Montrevel had built began to tremble beneath its own weight. What had once thrived in shadow now strained under the pressure of scale, greed, and whispers too loud to silence. The first crack appeared in the ledgers. Montrevel demanded ever more elaborate spectacles, festivals that required not dozens but hundreds of performers. The cost was staggering. Silk, cosmetics, elaborate sets, imported wines, musicians, architects, and the ever-growing network of recruiters, it all devoured fortunes. Some nobles bankrupted themselves to remain in Montrevel's circle. The Marquis de Rouvroy confessed to a confidant, "I sold my estate in Normandy to finance the Garden of Babel. My tenants starve, yet I, too, must bow to the appetite of Paris. To refuse is to vanish from the salons, and that, my friend, is worse than death." Beyond the gilded halls, the countryside burned with anger. Peasants spoke openly in taverns about children who had gone to service and never returned. Priests begged from their pulpits for protection, warning that God would smite those who trafficked in innocence. In some villages, mobs formed. Recruiters were chased into rivers, beaten with sticks, left bleeding on roadsides. Even among the aristocracy, discontent stirred. Not all stomachs were strong enough for Montrevel's art. A baron's wife fainted during a spectacle in which a boy was suspended for hours in the summer heat. Later, in private, she confided, "This is not art, but abomination. We call it philosophy only to mask our own rot." But her words never left the private chamber, for to speak them publicly was dangerous. Still, the rumors spread. Pamphleteers in Paris, emboldened by the growing winds of reform, whispered that the nobles feasted not only on bread and wine but on souls. Though censors seized many tracts, enough copies circulated to plant seeds of rage in the populace. Montrevel dismissed it all with a sneer. flies buzzing at a feast. He told the society, "The rabble has always hated brilliance. Let them chatter while we create immortality." Yet his arrogance blinded him. The peasants he mocked were sharpening scythes not for harvest but for revolution. Section 8. The Archives Uncovered. The storm broke in the summer of 1791. Revolution thundered across France, toppling centuries of monarchy. Estates were stormed, titles stripped, and nobles dragged from gilded halls into the streets. When the mob reached Chateau Belcourt, they expected wine, jewels, and silk. What they found instead was darker. Behind a concealed panel in Montrevel's library lay iron doors, their locks heavy and ornate. The rebels, thinking they had found treasure, smashed them open. What spilled out was not gold but parchment. Dozens of volumes, bound in leather, filled with meticulous script. Ledgers listing names, ages, villages of origin. Journals describing experiments. Correspondence with nobles across Europe. Instructions for building stages, for disguising transports, for silencing priests. The rebels carried the papers into Paris. Prosecutors of the Revolutionary Tribunal, hardened men accustomed to blood, recoiled as they read. Pages described starvation inflicted to study, the effects of weakness upon song. Others chronicled how long a child could endure silence before breaking into madness. One journal by Bishop Mirefleur coolly argued that suffering refines the soul like fire tempers steel. A clerk assigned to copy the documents vomited after reading only a few pages. "I have seen men gutted on the battlefield," he said, "but never words that stank so foul as these." Words spread quickly. Pamphlets reprinted passages, igniting public fury. Mothers who had lost children wept openly in the streets. Crowds demanded vengeance not only for bread and taxes, but for innocence stolen in the name of philosophy. The society's carefully crafted facade had crumbled. What had been whispered as rumor was now undeniable fact, preserved in their own proud handwriting. Section 9. Collapse and Punishment. The trials began in early 1792, packed with spectators hungry for justice. Montrevel himself was dragged before the tribunal, his once immaculate wig gone, his silks replaced by coarse cloth. Yet he stood proudly, as though the courtroom were another salon, and the guillotine merely a stage. The prosecutor read aloud from Montrevel's journals. "Pain is a language purer than speech. In the cries of the innocent we hear truths that no philosopher may write." Gasps filled the chamber. Women wept, men cursed aloud. Montrevel smirked. "You read poetry as though it were crime," he said. "You mistake art for atrocity. History will know me as a genius, not a villain." The crowd erupted in fury. The judges silenced them with difficulty, but the verdict was inevitable. Montrevel was sentenced to death. On the day of his execution, he attempted to speak as the blade hovered above, but the mob drowned him out with jeers. His head fell into the basket, ending the reign of the so-called philosopher of appetite. Others met similar fates. The Marquise de Chalons slit her wrists in her cell. Madame de Vaurienne fled to Switzerland but was found dead from poison, whispered to have been silenced by former allies. Bishop Mirefleur was dragged from his parish, stripped of his vestments, and executed before a crowd chanting psalms twisted into curses. Across Europe, panic spread. English lords burned correspondence. German princes paid scribes to forge innocent alibis. But the French archives contained enough names to blacken reputations from Lisbon to Warsaw. Diplomats scrambled, some governments quietly purging their own aristocrats implicated in the scandal. The network that had once spanned a continent collapsed in ashes. Section 10. Aftermath and Warning. When the fires of the Terror subsided, and France staggered into the uncertain dawn of a new age, the archives remained. Some revolutionaries argued for their destruction, claiming that such filth should not stain posterity. Others, more sober, insisted they must be preserved. Not to honor the nobles, but to warn the future. Fragments survive even now. In hushed libraries, behind restricted shelves, lie pages that speak of philosophy turned to poison, of art wielded as a weapon, of human lives reduced to ledgers. Historians debate whether Montrevel and his circle were uniquely wicked or merely products of a system that bred arrogance and indulgence unchecked. Some argue that their depravity was inevitable in a society where power faced no constraint. Others say it was a dark aberration, a madness of an age drunk on its own brilliance. But all agree on one truth: the aristocrats were not monsters by nature. They were men and women, refined and educated, who convinced themselves that cruelty was culture. Their error was not only in their acts but in their justifications, the belief that intellect excused atrocity, that privilege erased morality, that power itself was a form of reason. The revolution ended their reign, but their lesson endures. Absolute power corrupts not in sudden thunderclaps, but in subtle whispers of justification. Today, as then, behind gilded doors and polished words, humanity risks repeating its darkest follies. For behind every hall of mirrors, every polished facade, every proud proclamation of refinement, there may yet lurk another theater of flesh, waiting for silence, waiting for complicity, waiting for history to look away.